Okay, today as we start out now in Romans chapter 1 and in verse 1, I want to make a comment about something as far as introductory material is concerned that we didn't have time to talk about last week. And it is an important thing. And that is the book of Romans has a particular purpose for being written. Now we went through them zip, 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 zip like this, 3 or 4 things. Paul was writing a letter of commendation for a lady by the name of Phoebe, and she's moving to Rome, and she had asked Paul to write her a letter of commendation. He did, and then he included it in the book of Romans. So you'll find that in the last chapter of the book of Romans. Then again, Paul, in his 20 years of preaching, had never been to Rome. And of course, everybody knew, just like everybody in this generation knows, they knew Paul was the apostle appointed to go to the Gentiles. And here is the most famous or well-known city and church in the world, Rome. And Paul has never been there in 20 years. So Paul is getting ready to go to Rome. And the church has been established now for almost 30 years, 20, 30 years. And so he is preparing them and letting them know why he hasn't been there before. He doesn't just want to drop in and say, okay, here I am, an apostle to the Gentiles, here I am. And somebody said, well, that took you quite a little while to get here. I mean, it's been 20, 25 years now since you've been out there preaching. And now then you're just coming in. So Paul then takes time in the first chapter and again in the 15th chapter to explain to them, here is why I haven't been there before. So he's preparing them and showing them, I've intended to come to you. I wanted to come to you all this period of time, but every time I'd make my preparation, Satan would have something to happen and it would keep me from coming up and visiting you. So he went to quite a lot of trouble to explain that to them, getting them ready for his visit that was up there. But then you get down to the doctrinal part of the book. Why did Paul write this book of Romans? And he wrote the book of Romans to show that salvation is by faith. That really is what the book is about. Now we're going to be getting right into that in the first chapter, down in verse 17. We won't be getting into it this morning, but we'll be getting into it as we get down in there. That he's going to introduce the subject in chapter 1. Then he will start developing the subject in chapters 2 and 3 and 4 and 5. He's going to develop it and show. Now here's what I mean. Salvation is by faith in contrast to being by works of the law. Then he will use other things and show them the end result of this. But that's what we're going to be getting into. But now, nobody starts a letter and in the first sentence just starts in and says, here's what I want to talk about. There will be some kind of a salutation. Hello John, hello Sue, something of this nature. Now, in the book of Galatians, Paul just kind of jumps into it. Paul said, Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ unto the Galatians, and bing! And he really starts in because he's condemning those people. And he said, I'm amazed at you people. But still, he had a salutation. But in all of his other books, well, he had a rather long salutation. And in the book of Romans, it's a rather long salutation. It's about 7 verses long. But in every statement, in every phrase, he says something that is very, very significant. And things that are really deep doctrinal things that he says to them in this book. So now then, he's going to start out. And as he starts out, he says, Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle, separated unto the gospel of God, which he promised afore through the prophets unto the Holy Scriptures, concerning his Son, who was born of the seed of David, according to the flesh, who was, and have run out of air. Now you say, what do you mean you run out of air? Well, if I'm waiting for a period in order to take a breath, in other words, make a statement, and then take a breath, there are no periods in there. Between verse 1 and down to verse 7, it's all one sentence. but it's just one point after another that is in there. So here's what he's starting out now to say, and every word really has a great significance in this. As I've got here, the salutation is really this: Paul, to all that are in Rome. That's who he's writing to. Now then, all the verses in between there are very interesting verses. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. And we'll see that a lot of doctrinal things that he teaches us in this particular salutation in the book of Romans. So he starts out, his first word is Paul. And then he introduces himself as, with what authority he has. He said, a servant of Jesus Christ. So I, Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ. Now this word servant literally means a slave of Jesus Christ. Now that word in itself is kind of interesting, and it's something we don't point out a whole lot of times. Everybody knows what a slave is. A slave is more than an employee. You guys that work down at Boeing, you might say, well, I'm a slave of Boeing and so forth, but you know better than that. A slave is somebody who is owned by someone, and you don't have a choice in what you're going to do. They're going to give you the orders. You'll do it, whether you like it or not. Your will is not important, and you'll be punished if you don't do it. That really is what a slave is. But now, in the first century, a slave was something else, and this is the point that we don't point out a whole lot. That is, a slave was a position of honor. And you might say, well, how in the world could it be a position of honor? Well, here's what would happen. Every rich man would have slaves. They have slaves to go out and do all the slave work. But every rich man also had a slave that was working beside him, right there beside him, helping him run his business. He would take a slave, one that was good in mathematics, and then he would put him over the books. And this slave would be in charge of all the finances, all the books, and this guy would become dependent upon him. He might have another slave that he was a doctor, and he was the personal physician of this particular individual. Now, these slaves were positions of honor. They would go with this man everywhere he went. They handled all of his technical work that was there. And so as he was going around, and you can imagine, suppose a guy flew in from New York. He's going to meet with Boeing tomorrow, and the president of Boeing and so forth, they're going to be talking about a big business deal. Well, he walks in. They would come in. They say, well, I'm the CEO. This right here is the treasurer of the company. This right here is this. They would introduce each other, and everybody would be what we would call big shots. They would be important people. In that day, they would have introduced him. Now, here is my slave, the treasurer. Here's my slave, this. And they would be a position of honor. And most of the time, when these slaves in this position of honor, when they served the master, they would somewhere along their life be given their freedom and be rewarded in great ways. Many of them would become rich, and it was a position of honor. Now, as you look at this word, when Paul made the statement in the first century, it would carry the connotation of, you would have to say, wonder which one that he is. What he's saying is that I, Paul, I'm a servant of Jesus Christ. I belong to Jesus Christ. He's going to show how he came to be the servant of Jesus Christ. But I belong to him. I'm a spatial individual that's in here. He said, I was called to be an apostle. Now the way he phrases it in the original language is he says, I was a called apostle. I'm not just a servant who is some insignificant person, but I'm a servant who is a called apostle. I'm one that Jesus Christ himself called. It's just like our president today. You know, when he had Rumsfeld to move out, the Secretary of War, something else now, I can't come to my mind, but had him move out, well, he called another man. He called the president of one of the universities in Texas by the name of Gates. He called him, would you become, and here it is, and you're my right-hand man. And so he is a called secretary then. And that's the way Paul was. He was a special man. He was called in a special way to come to serve Jesus Christ in this way. There's many statements that Paul uses to show this, to show that he has no authority whatsoever, that he does have a lot of authority, but that authority resides in his position with Jesus Christ, that he has been given this. He is a called apostle. The reason he can speak with authority is not from himself, but because he has this relationship with Jesus Christ. As you look there about how he tells about his conversion that's in there, we all know, he saw that light on the road to Damascus. So they sent that man over, and he said, now the God of our fathers hath appointed you. So he wants us to see he didn't become an apostle just because he decided to be. But during this time, here it is, Ananias told him, he said, he's appeared to you to appoint thee a minister and a witness. Now he wants you to be his servant, and you're going to be a witness. That is, you're going to be an eyewitness. You're going to be one of the few people who will be able to go into the world and say, I stand almost alone. There are 11 other people that come with me. That is, the apostles. I'm in a special position. When I speak, I am speaking as one that has been called and appointed by Jesus Christ, and I speak as one who has seen these things with his own eyes. So I'm not going to be telling you anything that anybody's told me other than what I've seen with my own eyes and what the Lord has told me since he has called me here. Again in Galatians, he spends a lot of time. Paul, an apostle, not from men, neither through men, but through Jesus Christ and God the Father who raised him from the dead. And so he starts out, and the whole first chapter is showing, I am not preaching the doctrine of men. I am preaching the doctrine of Jesus Christ. I didn't even talk with Peter. I didn't ask any of the other apostles what I should say. The Lord appeared to me personally, and the Lord told me, and he speaks with all of that authority. So he's introducing himself to them in this particular way. He tells Timothy that this was committed to my trust. He said he was appointing me. So that word is really important to show Paul is constantly letting people know his position. And he says there, through the gospel, whereunto I was appointed. So Paul said, I didn't just usurp this position. I'm not coming to you, Romans, because I have decided this will be my role in life. But I am commissioned, I am appointed, I am chosen, I am called by Jesus Christ to do what I am doing. Then he says, he's a called apostle, separated unto the gospel. So the Lord Jesus called him. The Lord Jesus separated him, took him away from everything else. Paul was a man that was in high authority in the Jewish religion. We don't know what position he had in the Sanhedrin or anything, but he was a man of some great importance. But the Lord called him, and the Lord separated him. Now, what would that mean? The Lord called him, and the Lord separated him. Well, if the Lord called Mitchell over here and separated him, wouldn't make any difference what he's going to separate him into. It means that he's going to tell him, you leave whatever you're doing. Whatever you're involved in your life now, You leave it and you come over here. And here's what I want you to do. And then he would appoint him, instead of working for Boeing, here's what you're going to be doing. Instead of doing this, here's what you're going to be doing. That's what Jesus Christ did to Paul. He separated him. He said, leave. Walk away from whatever you have. Paul later said that he left everything. He said, I left everything in the book of Philippians. And he separated him unto the gospel. So you say, okay, Paul now had to leave this high position. He's separated from everything, every association, every business deal, everything that he has. He's separated. Now we're going to put this man over here doing something else. What will it be? Well, you'd think somebody that important, you might appoint him to half a dozen different things. He's really important. The Lord said, now, you're going to give up all of these things, and I'm separating you to put you in one position, one thing. It's the gospel. That's it. That's your realm. Your realm is not as a treasurer. Your realm is not as a doctor. Your realm is the gospel. You're going to be going out and you're going to be proclaiming the gospel in a very particular way. I'm going to send you to the Gentiles. Oh, you'll be preaching to the Jews. But you're also a man that's going to be preaching to the Gentiles. He told him, you're going to stand before kings. You're going to preach to the lowest of people. You're going to preach to the highest of people. You're going to preach to the religious Jews. You're going to preach to the heathenistic Gentile heathens out here. Paul, you're going to preach to them. And here's what you're going to tell them. You're going forth and you're going to tell them what you have witnessed with your own eyes. You are my witness. Now, Paul was a witness in a different way than the other apostles. They're all witnesses of the same thing, resurrection of Christ. But the others were living with Christ. Christ died, he rose, and they saw him. Now, Paul was not within that group. Later on, Jesus called Paul. And Paul stood alone in this way, and he could be a witness. On that road to Damascus, the light shone out, knocked him to the ground. Paul cried out, "Who art thou, Lord?" In other words, whoever you are up there in heaven, you are my Lord. And at that time, he said, "I am Jesus, whom thou persecutest." Paul later said, "I looked up and I actually saw him with my own eyes. I saw Jesus in heaven. He's there." Now, the rest of the apostles, they could testify that he raised from the dead. Now, that's what it's all about, resurrection of the dead. They could testify and say, "We know Jesus raised from the dead because we lived with him for 3 years. We saw him when he died. And then after he rose from the dead, we spent another 40 days with him. We watched him eat and drink. We examined his body that had been nailed to that cross. We know he's the same man that was put to death. We are witnesses that Jesus rose from the dead." Now, Paul is the same witness, only his is this way. He would go forth and he would say, "I, with my own eyes, have seen Jesus in heaven. He's there. He's not in the grave. He's there. I've seen him. He's there." Now, here's an interesting thing about Paul. What would you think about me if I came up here next week and told you that I saw Jesus? Jesus appeared to me this next Tuesday. He appeared to me and he said, "Lowell," and I have a small conversation with Jesus. So I can tell you he's up there. Why are you grinning? You know what you'd do to me, wouldn't you? See? You'd say you've lost your mind. You're crazy. Well, people say that about Paul too. He's lost his mind. He's crazy. The Athenians just got up and walked out on him. Paul had a couple of things that he could do that people could not ignore him. They might say you've lost your mind. In fact, Agrippa did say, Paul, you've gone berserk. You're going crazy. So people could say that. But he had two things that wouldn't make it stick. It wouldn't make it stick. Now, the first is pretty evident. What was the first thing Paul could do? If you wanted to deny he saw him, and he said, well, I can prove that I saw him, what would he do? He could perform a miracle, couldn't he? He performed all kinds of miracles. Everybody knew when a man could perform a miracle that God was with him. Whatever he said was true. Excuse me. But there's one other thing Paul had. When King Agrippa said, Paul, you're mad. That means you've gone crazy. What did he attribute it to? Your much learning. Paul, you are such an educated man. You know so much. You've learned so much that it's actually driven you out of your mind. Now, Paul was a unique apostle in this respect. What were all the other apostles? In Acts 2, that people were amazed at them. You know, when they were speaking in all these tongues and doing all these and had 3,000 conversions and and it was just amazing. But what did the people think about those other guys? Are not all these Galileans? Aren't they fishermen? These are not learned men. These are not men that would know languages. These are just fishermen. Now, how in the world did these unlearned ignoramuses speak and convince people they were telling the truth? What did they do? They performed miracles. They could do it just like Paul could do it. But Paul had another, what do you say, qualification, characteristic? He was highly educated. He had been brought up at the feet of Gamaliel, highly educated. And everybody respected him. He had been in the Sanhedrin. Everybody knew about him. It's just like, how many of you guys know Bill Jones? Anybody here know Bill Jones? See? Well, nobody knows him. How many of you know Bill Clinton? If I talk about Bill Clinton, you got any idea who I'm talking about? I don't care what you think about him. You know him, don't you? See? You know him. Now, when Paul, the apostle, the man that had been brought up in Jerusalem by the feet of Gamaliel, the leader of all mankind as far as education was concerned, history tells us, one of the, I think that history says he is within one of the 7 greatest learned men that the Jews have ever known. Here's his disciple. Here's the guy that he taught for all these many years, you see. So he's up. Everybody knows about him. How many people knew about him killing people in Jerusalem? Everybody knew about that, didn't they? See, they knew about it. And when he came back to Jerusalem, was he a well-known man when he wanted to join himself to the church and they wouldn't let him? No, sir. And he's a man that had to prove himself. But all I'm getting at is, when Paul went out, he went out as a person with a reputation, a person that was a learned man. And today, that still carries a lot of weight. That's what I'm working up to today. When you, our university professors will brush aside Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They'll brush aside these Bible writers in this way. And they'll say, well, they copied each other and they made up this story. They did that or they did this. But when they get to Paul, they're lost. And they can't say anything. In fact, there's 2 writers, or 2 speakers, Jesus and Paul. First of all, with Jesus. They can't say anything about him. They look at him and they say, well, he claimed to be the Christ, but he was kind of ignorant. He wasn't much. Well, we have his sermons, we have his sayings. And what does the world think about the sayings of Jesus? And I'm talking about atheists. What will they tell you about the Sermon on the Mount or his sayings? They just stand amazed. They all agree. They're the epitome of anybody who's ever tried to speak. He takes the smallest of words and he deals with the largest of subjects, and everybody can understand what he's saying, and clear as a bell, and it just kind of turns the world upside down. So what do they say about Jesus? Well, he was a great philosopher. He was a great philosopher. They can't ignore him. That's what I'm getting at. Now along comes Paul, and they can't ignore Paul, because Paul left behind 13 books. And when you start reading these 13 books, you're going to read books of such great depth, religious depth. Now let me talk as though he wasn't inspired, okay? The way an atheist would look at it. They start reading him, and they say, this man had his philosophy. I mean, he had developed a philosophy that is unknown to man. He just goes deep and deep and deep into these things, and he never contradicts himself, and he goes deeper than anybody could go. Wow. And then he writes another book and 13 books, and all of them have such great meaning. He never contradicts himself. He never makes a mistake. What other writer can say that? What other writer can say that? There are none. Every person who's written a book, you go over to the university, every person who's written a book at university, it's in that library, has become outdated or will become outdated in just a few years. They'll say, this is no longer relevant because we've learned so many things. Not so with Paul. So you ask people today, okay, you want to shrug off the other apostles, you want to set them aside, go ahead. Just go ahead. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, those ignorant fishermen. You don't want to pay any attention to them. Let's talk about Paul. What do you got to say about him? And that's the thing today that drives our professors crazy. There's nothing they can say about him. Now, when you look back and you see who he was, and you see that Jesus called him, he called him out of everybody in the whole world and said, Paul, you're mine. I'm separating you from everything that you have any association with. I'm putting you over one job, and that job is the gospel. That's what you're going to give your life to. And still today, he has such a tremendous impact that it just drives the enemies of Jesus crazy. So when Paul said, I, Paul, a servant of Christ, a called apostle, a spatial individual, somebody that is not just a has-been, and I've been separated unto the gospel. That's my job. And it is the gospel of God. That means it originated with God. I'm here to tell you that which was in God's mind originated in God's mind before the world ever began. Now, it's also called the gospel of Christ, because that's what the gospel is about. It's about Christ. And so I'm telling you the gospel that was planned by God, which is all about Christ, and he calls it the gospel of the apostles. He even says my gospel because it was preached by them. They're the ones that went out, the 12 men. They were the witnesses. Everybody else went out and preached what the witnesses told them. But you have 12 men who are witnesses then in this way. It's called the gospel of the kingdom because that's the result of it. When you preach the gospel that originated in the mind of God, and that gospel is about Jesus Christ, it's preached by those witnesses that saw him and testify he raised from the dead. The end result is going to be the gospel of God. You're going to learn about the gospel, you're going to get into the gospel, and you're going to belong to God. So as we start out, just that first word, Paul. I just wanted to talk this morning about just that first word, Paul. What an impact that had in the world. What a wonderful thing it is, and how God used him in this special way. Well, I make you one promise. I'm not going to just pick up every word and speak an hour on it from here on. We'll be picking up our pace. But as we start out here in the gospel, in the book of Romans, we do want to look at this introduction because it is a very meaningful thing. Okay, thank you.